went in with so much faith in government, in like the power of America to make the world a better place. And then to see our helplessness, whether it was contain an insurgency or put these vital building blocks for a democracy, and was like, oh crap, this is not how I'm going to actually make an effective difference in the world. I did not go into the agency thinking I was going to come out a peace builder, but in effect, that the transformation that happened, witnessing firsthand that tit for tat violence didn't do anything to quell the insurgency. It just accelerated it and intensified it. I don't think war is ever worth it. That's just why I'm putting my energies into preventing wars to begin with and to ending violence.
You're listening to the Wired for Impact podcast.
All right, I am here with Janessa Gans Wilder. She's a very special guest, someone who I've known for a very long time. We go all the way back to college days together. And one of the things I want to say before we get into anything is I am unfortunately feeling a little bit under the weather. So apologies in advance for any coughing or sniffles. I will try to mute myself. But Janessa has a fascinating career and perspective on something that I think is extremely important today, which is the Israeli-Palestine conflict. And of all the people on the planet, Janessa, I feel like you're one of the few people who have the experience that you have, that has the intention that you have. And I couldn't be more honored to have you on the program. So first and foremost, thank you for joining me.
Thank you, Peter. So fun to catch up after our college days.
I know, right? It's really quite an honor to have you on. I watched your TED Talk, which was brilliant, really beautiful. I encourage everyone to check it out. But Janessa was in the CIA. Let's go through your history real quick so people can get caught up to your background after you graduated from the school that we went to. Is that when you went to Stanford, or did you go back? Did you work? Okay. So why don't you explain to the listeners?
Sure. I went straight into grad school, and it was there that the CIA was recruiting. There was a booth, and I almost went up on a lark. I was like, oh, so you guys are the ones who assassinate foreign leaders and depose governments. And he said, no,
yeah.
we used, yeah. He's like, no, we used to. It's kind of against the law now.
He has to say that.
He gave me a pamphlet, and here is the zinger that he said that just completely changed my whole perspective on the CIA and why I would ever want to work there. But he said, we are the ones, with the access to the most information, and we are the ones who are closest to truth. And I just thought, well, what a great job title, to be the closest to truth, like to knowing and to information. And then he said, well, you're in grad school, you like school, right? And I was like, yeah, I'm in grad school. And he said, well, imagine writing papers, not just for your professor and your fellow classmates and giving presentations, but for the president. And I was like, oh, yeah, I'm sold, Imagine not only having that access to that kind of information, but then your audience is the president in the inner circle. So I left my resume, and then the rest is history.
That's very exciting. Was that something, did you aspire to be in the CIA, or was it just happen chance that you
It was literally, it was just a job fair. I'd stuck a few copies of my resume in my backpack. I was wandering around. The logo caught my eye, and I just went up truly to tease the guy, and then ended up leaving my resume and went through the whole process. While I was in grad school, it's a 6-month, very intensive security background check, and all the lie detectors and the psych exams and all of that. So it took me 6 months after I graduated from Stanford with my master's to actually start. And that was January 2001, 9 months before 9/11.
Wow. Jeez. What a time to start.
Yeah, I was in the middle of training when 9/11 happened. And really 9/11 is what got me started on the Middle East. I cared nothing at all about the region before 9/11. I just saw it as a bunch of people like fighting over a bunch of sand, religious kooks. And I avoided the topic like the plague at college and in grad school. And then 9/11 forever changed that idea that we can just ignore a region that we don't care about or that we don't fancy, but that actually every region affects us and impacts us. And we have to know what's going on all over the world. So of course, 9/11 changed my whole trajectory and what I focused on.
Yeah, it changed all of ours. What was your official title then when you started?
I was a CIA analyst working on Africa to begin with before 9/11. And then after that happened, I spent 2 years working on Afghanistan. So I was on a task force for the first 6 months during the Afghan war, and really kept bugging my bosses to try to go to the region, because to me, I couldn't continents, like being an expert on a region I'd never been to. I didn't speak the language of. I'd never met an Afghan in person. To me, to really know a place, you have to be there, you have to smell the air, you have to meet the people. And so I was such a thorn in their side, like bugging them to go to this country that I'd been writing about and briefing people on and pretending I knew what was going on. And but just from like information, but not actually going there. So 2 years later, the Iraq War was starting up, and I think my boss was just trying to get rid of me because I was such a persistent thorn in her side that she said, "How about going to Iraq?" No matter that I knew nothing about Iraq, that I'd been working all those 2 years on Afghanistan, but I think she was on the hook to pony up an analyst for their department. And so I was wanting to get out of my cubicle. She was wanting to send someone. So I thought about it for 2 minutes, and this is the thought that came to me. So I went back and sat down at my desk and realized I would rather dodge bullets than sit in this cubicle one more day. And immediately went back and told her, yes, send me. And that was supposed to be for 90 days, and that turned into 21 months.
It's quite a shift.
Yeah.
Where did you go to Israel first, Afghanistan first? Where did you end up first and foremost?
No, so just straight to Iraq, and that was the fall of 2003. And so that was right as the insurgency was brewing. And honestly, Peter, I mean, I really knew nothing about Iraq. It's so weird to imagine being an analyst on a place that nothing about. And so I showed up in country just really a sponge, just trying to understand who was fighting us and why. I was a counterinsurgency analyst when I first arrived in Iraq. So, the insurgency was just gaining ground. We were trying to understand, why they hated us. We went into Iraq expecting them to throw flowers, and instead they were planting bombs, and trying to understand the motivating forces and the driving factors, and plus like the layout of the leadership and the funding and just how the whole thing worked, and how you can do that, as someone not knowing the language with no background in the country, as we all were. It's not like there were other experts. Like we had one Arabic speaker in the entire station, CIA
Really?
station. Wow. Yeah. So we were all just getting off the ground cold, but I just was really obsessed with just trying to understand everything I could about the country. And that this is really kind of getting into what I'm writing the book about, but in a way, just so desperate to understand and to connect that, I made some really interesting decisions throughout my time there and made a lot of changes. And ultimately, that's what resulted in me leaving the CIA and founding a peace building organization. Just witnessing firsthand that going down that road of tit for tat violence of, okay, they're fighting us, so we're going to lay waste to places like Fallujah. And, that didn't do anything to quell the insurgency. If nothing, it just accelerated it and intensified it and resulted in not only thousands of our soldiers being killed, but over 100,000 Iraqis or more. It was just seeing it and witnessing both an Iraqi colleague of mine being killed, not witnessing his death, but knowing him personally. And, he didn't show up to work that day, and seeing our soldiers coming back wounded from the field. And it just really hit me on a deeper emotional level that this is not a road that is sustainable. This is, like we wouldn't wish this on anyone. What are ways to prevent this from happening in the future? And so that really is what it launched me into this whole other field of peace building, which I did not go into the agency thinking I was going to come out a peace builder. But in effect, that's the transformation that happened during my time in Iraq. Iraq was really the formative time. And then Israel-Palestine became another obsession later on. And I can tell you the story of how I ended up there my first time too.
If I could ask you about, first and foremost, what did you find when you went to Iraq? Why did they hate us? What was it that you found?
Yeah, that's a great question. So much of it had to do with a certain kind of, in a way, really, so I was focused on Western Iraq, and they called it the Wild West. And similar to a lot of places in the US where people are like country folk, very prideful, like distrustful of foreigners. There's like strong local loyalties, there it was tribal loyalties. And so you had this foreign entity coming in with our big lumbering tanks, and um, folks were trigger happy. They'd been there a while. They're on the defensive. They're worried. And so, for example, in Fallujah, which is where I spent time during the first battle there. The year before, the army there was a protest, and who knows who shot what first, but we ended up killing 70 people, innocent Fallujans who were involved in this protest. And then that, it was kind of simmering since then and exploded a year later. So it's the combination of just us not knowing the terrain, coming in with our big forces, and then incidents happen. And really, we were seen as these foreign invaders. Were we there to improve their lives? And they thought, oh, the rich Americans are coming. We're all going to get a Mercedes, and the electricity is going to work all of a sudden. And, life is going to be beautiful. And the electricity never got turned on. The opposite happened. Looting happened, and we didn't control it. We didn't contain it. Terrorism was rising, and it was not really affecting Americans. It was much more affecting local Iraqis. So they saw it as this plot that, of course, we could get bin Laden if we really wanted to. We could put an end to terrorism. We were letting it foment. So it's just a lot of miscommunication, and I think misperception, them thinking that we were going to come immediately improve things, us coming in thinking they were going to welcome us with open arms. And it was that clash. And it's hard when you are in that kind of security situation to venture out and get to know the local population, which was what I felt so frustrated about. Is how am I supposed to understand the insurgency if I can't even leave the base, and consort with the local population, or really get to know the people to understand the loyalties and the motivations. And so there was that too. It was just we were ensconced behind barbed wire, behind big bases, and the local people are there. And I think when you have that separation and then you have separation of culture and language and all that, it's just really hard to get to know each other when there are these divisions.
This is a tough question, but was it worth it?
That's such a good question. My good friend who was in the parliament there, and I was there for the first elections. I had the chance to vote, and the Constitution was going to build after that. And he said, watch what happens when the rest of the Arab world sees that Iraqis are voting, that we have democracy, that we have freedom. He said, it's going to spark something. It's going to start a ripple effect. And I was like, you're crazy. What are you thinking? What are you saying? And when the Arab Spring happened 6 years later in 2011, he reached back out to me and he said, do you remember that conversation? Of course, that started in Tunisia, but it hit Egypt and Syria and all over. But he believed that it was actually seeing the reality of democracy and, freedom and people voting and all the purple fingers, waving in the air. That really sparked that. And who's to say, if that's true or not? And of course, the Arab Spring has not worked out the way that we wanted to. But I was recently on a call with some folks from the embassy that I'd worked with, and they said, look, that there has been progress. There's still democracy in Iraq. There's still functioning elections. There's still, turnover of leadership. There's still, people out canvassing and politicians, responding to the public and to the electorate. And it's not perfect, but, ours wasn't perfect in a day either. We fought a civil war. They didn't fight a civil war in Iraq. They still have democracy. So, is it? I mean, is it better than a Saddam type dictatorship where people were malnourished and disappearing by the thousands? But was it worth our blood and treasure? Was that our role to put something like that up in the region to prop up a government like that? I don't know. I don't even ask those questions. To me, it was just, that was the reality. We were going into Iraq, and I wanted to be part of making it the best it could be. And that's what was so frustrating, was seeing here is the American military might and trillions of dollars at our disposal. And, even with all and like the goodwill and intention, to see so many mishaps and so many mistakes and to see, people's lives crushed, I don't think war is ever worth it. I don't
Hmm.
think that that is an outcome that will result in anything other than more violence and that tit for tat. It's like the ripple effect of war is never what we want to put into effect. So yeah, that's just why I'm no longer putting my energies into something like this. I'm putting my energies into preventing wars to begin with and to ending violence, like to stopping violence.
What was the pivot point for you? Everybody that I've known that has served
Yes.
in some capacity in a war zone area has said those exact same words. It's not worth it. What was it for you where you woke
Interesting.
up and
Yeah.
realized this is not this is not actually achieving the goals that we're set out to do, and now I'm going to go on a different trajectory?
Yeah, it was actually a spiritual epiphany by the Euphrates River.
Hmm.
And so I had just come from that first major battle. It was the largest major battle since combat operations had ended almost a year earlier. So, it was the real thing. I was wearing my Kevlar all the time. I was sleeping in a tent with six guys. I was running out to the sandbags. Mortars were crashing overhead and I was exhausted. I hadn't slept in 10 days. It was
Wow.
just the darkest and heaviest. And like even now, I always just feel emotional, like even thinking back to that period. Like it just felt dark. There was just no light. This, this is where we've ended up, like death
Mhm.
and destruction and killing and like not and then I just felt so helpless to do anything about it. And so a few weeks later, I was staying on another military base, and the operation had ended, and so things were a little quieter. And I'd gone for a run one afternoon, and I came back to the house and went up on the roof, and it was sunset, and the base was really just a house. The house was right next to the Euphrates River that was, floating by, and I just like took in this scene, the purples and oranges and pinks of the sunset, and there were birds flying through the sky, and the water, like the only thing I could hear was the water, the tinkling of the water floating by and the swaying of the bulrushes. And if you can imagine like the loudest, like war, like no one tells you about the noise factor,
Mhm.
like just
Mhm.
the noise was so intense that I felt like my body would split apart just from the sound alone. Like just it was so intense. And then I remember up on the roof, like straining to listen. I'm like, the only thing I could hear was the sound of nature and like the sound of that quiet and that stillness. And, I'm looking out at this scene and realized that this river, just a few miles downstream, was flowing in the middle of Fallujah, in the middle of, the war had been raging and death and destruction. And of course, I'd never noticed the river, but it was happening in that same space.
Mhm.
And this thought came to me out of nowhere. I don't know if it was the river speaking to me or divine presence or what, but the question was, which will you choose? I was like, what do you mean, which will I choose? And I could literally, like argued back with this thought, like, which will you choose? And I realized like I couldn't focus on both things at the same time. The war and the sounds of explosions and just all of it had been so consuming that it's like it takes all your attention. But really, the river had been there all the time. And if you
Mhm.
think about Al Anbar province, Western Iraq, it's just complete desert. It's rugged, steppe terrain, it's sand dunes, it is just so brown and dry. And the river is the only source of life. Like all the people live clustered around the river. It's the only source of life in this whole area. And so you had this contrast between this river of life flowing in the midst of death. And so, yeah, it was one or the other. And so, the question, which will you choose? And I just said, I knew in my being that not only like did I need the peace and stillness of that river, like everything in my body was like, of course, like that is what I need. I was yearning for some kind of light and hope. But I also had the thought that it was the more powerful force because all those
Mhm.
bombs that had been going off didn't touch it, like did not affect the river's flow in the slightest. The trajectory of that river remained completely unfazed and untouched. And so I knew, even though it was more subtle, that it was the more powerful force. And so I said out loud, I said, I choose the river. And, who knows what that meant? I just was like, I choose the river. And, tears came to my eyes and I was just soaking in this scene, and really didn't know that at the time that was going to be the moment. It was just like, to me, it was just this thing that I needed to hear, needed to feel. But that turned out to be the pivotal moment where I went back and told my boss I didn't want to do counterinsurgency anymore. I was tired of focusing on the problem. I wanted to be part of the solution. What could I possibly, do? I couldn't do it anymore. Mm-hmm. And God bless those people in our lives who, see opportunities or like see what's best in us and help us along. He could have said, shut up and do your job, or
Mm-hmm.
and like, especially in the government, the agencies are so parochial and territorial, but he ended up finding me a job at the embassy and basically letting me go as a loner and working for the political office. So instead of focusing on the problem, I was focused on the solution and helped prepare for the first democratic elections in Iraq. So that really was the turning point, when the river called, which will you choose?
That's so beautiful. There's something about bodies of water, for me anyway, that are divine, that really do speak to you. I watched a really compelling documentary on Amazon Prime. I think it's just called Gaza. Might be Gaza Strip, but I think it's just Gaza. But anyway, it's one of the few silver linings for the people that live there is just the ocean, and they can surf a little bit or whatever. But even still, they're not allowed to go out further than 2 miles supposedly, so they can't really fish. Like it's tantalizing because it's right there. It feels like freedom, but they really can't exercise it and explore it, which was so frustrating to watch. So that moment was a pivot point for you, sitting on the bank of the river there. And you started the institute called the Euphrates Institute, which is a peace building effort. It's a nonprofit, right?
Yeah.
Tell us about your work there. And then, because it's my understanding that you then went and lived in Gaza for some time.
Not in Gaza, but in Palestine. Yeah, the Palestinian territories. Gaza is
Gotcha.
part of that, but I've never been to Gaza. It's been blockaded since 2006, and that was the first time I went to the 2005 was, but anyway, it was months before the blockade.
But you were on the Palestinian side, though.
Yes,
yeah, that's fascinating.
Let me say one thing about the body of water, and it's so interesting, Peter, because just this past week I was sharing how I've never liked the ocean.
What?
It feels so exposed and like vulnerable. Like I'm open to attack. Like it's just like give me a forest with protected by trees and safe and comforted, and it's just there's something so vulnerable and exposed. And this woman I was talking to, and she was like, but Janessa, all rivers flow into the ocean, and the ocean, if you think about it, is just even more of an expanse of that infinite love. Like it just shows like the vastness and infinity. And it was a nice reframing. And there's something so potent to going back to rivers and, like you said, bodies of water and these mythical things. But the Euphrates River, after that experience, I ended up doing all this research. And in all the religions, it is featured as this like main, not just like the physical, but like its symbolic significance and spiritual significance, which is so interesting. Like even in biblical times, the Euphrates River shows up at the beginning. It's one of the rivers of the Garden of Eden, of the cradle of civilizations, and at the end of times. So it like shows up in both of those times. And I saw the river as this boundary. It was always referred to throughout the kingdoms of Israel, all through the Bible, as the boundary between East and West. And I thought, okay, but what is a boundary? A boundary is also a place where two sides connect. It's not just like a dividing line between here's us, but this is the meeting point and the connection point. And so I started Euphrates as this bridge between East and West, because to me, what 9/11 symbolized and what Samuel Huntington, a prominent political scientist, had talked about years before was the clash of civilizations between West and East. He foretold that the West and Eastern civilizations were going to have this huge cultural clash. And so it was like, oh, the Euphrates, since biblical times, has been seen as the dividing line. But it can really be, instead of a clash, can we have a connection? Can we understand each other more? Can we understand how tied we are to the region? Like, not only is the Middle East the birthplace of our religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, which more than half of the world's population, well over half, practice, but also energy for decades, it's been the largest source and provider of oil. And then our security is tied to the region. All the wars that we've been embroiled in have been in the Middle East, terrorist attacks, all of our security interests tied to that region. And so if we see how impacted we are, from that part of the world, and in turn, of course, we are always embroiling ourselves in their affairs. So how interdependent and interconnected, I just thought that the river could even speak to that, symbolically. So anyway, rivers can be metaphors in so many ways.
I was just going to say the metaphors, symbols are such powerful reframes. And I love that reframe because it really does speak to the heart of your intention and your efforts of not looking at how we're different, but how do we extend a hand and make that connection and find the commonalities between us. When you lived in that area, what did you learn about the people there, and what did you learn about the conflict? It's very easy for people, armchair people like myself, to see what's going on and look at it through a lens of black and white. It occurred to me as I was doing some research for this episode that it's almost like two sides of a rope, and it's like, if you think that there's only two sides and you pull on your one side that you have allegiance to, you're just strengthening the knot. And there's so much more nuance to this. Like, I was hearing things about Palestinians who lived in Israel who were saying, look, you guys are misunderstanding the perpetrators here. You have other people in Israel who say the same thing about Palestinians. I worked with this guy. He was great. We had him over for dinner all the time. His family's great. There seems to be a lot of possibility, a lot of potential for peace. And yet we're talking about biblical level conflict. So what did you find out being in that area, which also, I think what's so important or interesting is that you didn't necessarily have an allegiance religiously, family ties, whatever. So you had, I think, maybe a relatively as unbiased a perspective as one person can have. So help us understand what you learned about each side and the nuance of this conflict.
Well, I'll mention what drew me to the region to begin with, and it kind of shows the roots and how tied in Americans are to this conflict and what's going on. So on my way home from Iraq, so I've been in Iraq 21 months, I'm tired. Of course, I want to go home, but I knew I could not leave the region without going to Israel and Palestine. Because at the time in Iraq, I heard so many times, you are just like the Zionists in Israel, you Americans. This is an occupation, just like in Palestine. And, the word Zionist and occupation were just constantly thrown into meetings. And I was like, what's so bad? Like, look at all we're doing for you from our U.S. occupation. Like, why is that so bad? And why are the Zionists so evil? And I just couldn't understand their intense antipathy for Zionism and occupation. And so I went and I visited a friend in Jerusalem and stayed with someone from the embassy. And it was against the rules for me as a U.S. diplomat to go into the Palestinian territories unless it was official business and unless I had full armored vehicles and the whole thing. So I was like, oh, dang, I'm not going to get to see the other side. I had a great time in Israel and saw all the religious sites and went sightseeing and everything. But I ran into this cab driver who was Palestinian outside the Garden of Gethsemane. And I said, just by happenstance, tell me how far it is to get to Bethlehem. Because I thought, oh, how sad to come to the region and not go to Bethlehem either, like the birthplace of Jesus. And he's like, oh, I'm from Bethlehem. I can have you there and back in 30 minutes. And it's like this ratty, cab. And I'm like, okay, let's just go. And I was alone. Of course, I didn't have there's no official anything. And I hop in the backseat of his cab and we start driving and we go through this enormous checkpoint And I'm like, oh, here it goes, like on the other side of the wall. And there was a big wall that separates, Israel and Palestine. And so you pass through checkpoints to get there. And so we're passing through on the other side. And I'm just imagining, I mean, I've never met Palestinians before, but all I'd heard was, the terrorist hijackings in Munich and just all these stories in the news. And I'm literally expecting like masked people with machine guns to be lining the roads, and I'm ducking in the back of the cab, and I'm like, I'm a diplomat, oh my gosh, I'm a US official. And he takes me through the town, and we go see the church that was built on where Jesus was born. And then he takes me to his cousin's tea shop or whatever, and I end up staying there for hours and talking to the family, and everyone else who came in like heard someone was there, and they just kept coming in and had fascinating conversations about how since the wall had been built, which much of it is built actually on Palestinian land that was supposed to be reserved for a Palestinian state, not even Israeli, that, employment has plummeted, that tourism has plummeted, unemployment has gone up, and just the huge, ramifications that they used to be able to go to Jerusalem to pray or for an afternoon. And now they have to have special permits which are not even issued. And so it just has completely cut them off from the rest of the world. And then, of course, so friendly, like Palestinians are actually such a warm, hospitable people, so welcoming, completely different from the image I'd had in my mind. And I was hooked. I was sold. I was like, this conflict, they're talking about this conflict in Iraq. Like, this is affecting our policies in Iraq. Like, I could just see the ripple effect that this tiny part of the world had on everything, all of our major religions, all of our security, all of the things that I'd mentioned. It was just such an outsized influence and significance of what was going on here that I'm like, I have to come. So I came back months later and studied Arabic and lived in the Palestinian territories, in Birzeit. It's a town near Ramallah, so that I could both get like the political education and the language, because I knew, that there was just so much to uncover. And while living in Palestine, I mean, there were Israeli tanks coming through, there was tear gas, there were raids. We had to we were at a nightclub in Ramallah. We had to like run for our lives because tanks were coming through. I mean, you go through the checkpoints, which take forever. But as an American, I could breeze through them. They'd be waiting all day. It's just, there is a sense that daily life is so not only unpredictable, but so arduous and so unsafe for average Palestinians. And then I'd go on the other side of the wall and go party in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. It's a whole other world. Like life in Israel is like Disney. It's wonderful. I can wear mini skirts and take it's peaceful. It's fun. It's safe relatively. And so again, we were talking in the beginning about like the separation between the two worlds. Like the two sides just don't understand the other's reality. And when you put up things like 21-foot concrete walls, and barriers to divide people, yes, it does help with security because fewer Palestinians were getting in to bomb buses in Tel Aviv, in Israel. But what it does to the average relations and interconnections between the folks who live there is so tragic. And I think, when we get to the nuances, Tony Blinken yesterday, Secretary of State, was saying the number one thing at the issue of this conflict is the dehumanization of the other. He said that is the root of what's going on, is when people have so misunderstood and distrusted and dehumanized the other, that how is there a potential for, and he was saying like, that's what we have to work on. That's the number one obstacle at the root of this conflict and the obstacle to peace. And I think separation is the first step to dehumanization, is not knowing the other, not seeing the other, not understanding the other and their lives and what they're going through. And so, one other way I'll boil it down too is, so for Palestinians, they say the core for this conflict for them is a sense of justice. Like they want justice. They did nothing to do, the Holocaust wasn't their fault. That was in Europe, and yet the local folks who were living there, Israel, the Jews were given that part of the world as really their, not consolation prize, but like as a safe haven for them. But there was also a local population living there. at the time. So of course, as they're being deprived of homes, and then you have the new government being formed, which forcibly removed 700,000 people, or they fled. It was both. They were both forcibly removed, and the Palestinians fled. So you had their own, they call it their own Holocaust. The Nakba is, Arabic for Holocaust. And so they feel like, what did they do to deserve any of that happening? They were not part of the original catastrophe, which was the Holocaust in Europe. For Israelis and for Jews who had just survived a Holocaust, a genocide, as we know, all the horrible facts and figures, 6 million Jews exterminated, for them to have like one little piece of land that they could call their own, just one. They're not asking for, huge grand territory. They just want one little strip of land that they can be safe as Jews in the world, that never again will they be subjected to another Holocaust. For them, it's about security. So if you have these two competing interests, justice and security, and I had a Jewish American friend of mine say, when Palestinians start working for security and Israelis start working for Palestinian justice, that's when we'll have peace, which I love. For the other to actually so understand the root need and issue at the core of all of this, then again, it gets back, if we can understand the other, understand what's really driving it, and then address that, then we'll see some progress.
I have a limited perspective on this, so bear with me. But is it possible? I'm going to throw this out there, and I'd love to get your take on it. Is it possible? Let me take a step back. I've talked to my Jewish friends. I've talked to, I don't have any direct, close Palestinian friends, but I've seen interviews. I've seen these documentaries. I have friends that are Muslim, et cetera, not necessarily Palestinian. But in my base understanding, there seems to be a very clear intention of just, we want to live peacefully. We don't want conflict. We may see things a little bit differently. Many Palestinians lived in Israel peacefully. Is it possible that there is a third entity that is creating division amongst relatively peacefully seeking people that are benefiting from it? Because as an example, you talked about the wall, the 21-foot wall that separated the two. Most Palestinians, that at least I saw, that I experienced, is they were like, life was better when we were able to integrate a little bit more. This is not good. Hamas essentially has taken over. And yet at the same time, they also said on some level, it was also a security organization that it provided some level of stability. It was like a police. If you had an issue, somebody stole from you, you'd call Hamas. That was like the local police. So I get on maybe that tiny perspective that there's some security there. But on the other hand, it does seem from the outside looking in my limited perspective, that this is another entity that separates itself from the average Palestinian, the average Israeli, that is putting itself in the middle. And I'll even go to what Netanyahu said, where he said, if you want instability in the area, fund Hamas. And he was saying that from a pro perspective of let's stick it to them. Exactly. Yeah. And it's like, there seems to be ulterior motives. And is it possible that that's who Palestinians and Iraqis are pointing to as Zionists and not necessarily your average everyday Israeli? That's where my mind goes. It's like, it seems like there are other parties involved here that are leveraging the highly emotionally intense conflict for their own benefit, but they're operating a little bit out of the frame so you can't see them.
Boy, you brought up a lot there.
Yeah, I know. I mean, that's probably a whole podcast in and of itself. I'll just say this to give a little bit more detail. You have Iran funding Hamas. You have the U.S. funding Iran. You have the U.S. funding Mossad and Israel. You have the most recent conflict, the horrible one where they flew over and slaughtered all those Israelis. There clearly was. It just smells funny to me. It's just, I can't imagine that one of the top security agencies on the planet allowed that to happen and didn't have a response for hours while their people were just getting raped and slaughtered. And it's horrible. And there are still hostages that are in Palestine. It's horrific. So to me, that's not your average person. The stuff that I saw was, the guy was a seamstress. He was a Palestinian guy. He was a seamstress. And he's working on his thing, and the electricity goes out, and he throws his hands up. Like, that to me is the average Palestinian. It's the kid growing up that goes, "Teach me how to serve," Or, I don't know. It just seems like that's we're talking about two different groups here, or multiple groups, not just two flags. Does that make sense?
So yes, and I appreciate the context and the detail. First word I learned in Arabic, Peter, was mu'amara, which means conspiracy. In the absence of trusted news and information, there were conspiracies about everything. And people wholeheartedly believed it. I mean, I don't mean not just that there was a 9/11, which was also, very rampant, but that we're doing this and we're doing that, as if like the US government was some all-powerful, all-knowing entity that could do its will at will. That we just were that. And I kept telling them, we're really dumb. We're really not that smart. Like, even if we had thought of this, there's no way we could have figured out how to do it, or that the news wouldn't have found out about it. Like, it's just such a bumbling giant thing that really doesn't know its head from its tail, and is just like trying to do stuff, and filled with people. And so my gut reaction is to discount the conspiracies, because having like been in the government and working with smart people and top people that all their energy, and just seeing the sausage making process it is to get anything done and approved, and when it is, it's always late, and it's always behind the more nimble actors who on the ground, surgeons who just could be, so thoughtful and creative in their approach, and we just were so behind the curve every single time. So I always just am like, no, there's no, at least when it comes to American policy, I do not ever believe these conspiracies that we have more going on up there than we do. But I will say that the Middle Eastern approach to things is more calculated and more thoughtful, and like less bureaucracy to get in the way of things. And so, for example, on Iran, which in Iraq, they were so long-term strategic thinking. They would make inroads and fund these tiny grassroots groups on the ground, knowing that in 30 years that would benefit them, that they would gain sway over people's allegiances and religious sensibilities, or they'd see the goodwill coming from this charitable contribution. Like, it was just so long-term and strategic, so opposite of how we do our foreign policy. It was amazing to watch. Amazing. And just today I was talking to our exchange student in Gaza. He called me this morning, and I was like, oh, good. I'm going to be talking about, the conflict on this afternoon. And I said, what do people there think about Iran's role and what's going on? He said, we hate Iran because Iran supported Hamas, and we hate Hamas. And for them, it's that simple. It's of course, Hamas is just a tool for Iran. And since we hate Hamas, we hate Iran, because Iran doesn't care about us, the people. They only care about scoring one on their archenemy, Israel, and by extension, the US. And we are pawns. And he also, said what we talked about, how average Gazans, I won't say West Bank because it's totally different in the West Bank. The average Gazan hates Hamas. What have they done for them? They did perpetrate this horrible attack, knowing Israel's blowback was going to be severe, if not, this kind of level. And they didn't care, because they were scoring, one on Israel, and they wanted to destroy Israel. But the average person just wants the blockade to be lifted, just wants a job, just wants, peace and stability. And so the people who have lived under Hamas hate Hamas. The Gazans, average, the Poles are they're not in support of Hamas. But it's the West Bank Palestinians, they're separate, geographically separate. The West Bank Palestinians, Hamas is wildly popular. Because one, they're not living under Hamas's rule. And two, to them, Hamas is the only group standing up for Palestinian justice and rights, and standing up to Israel. In the West Bank, Palestinians are not allowed to have a gun or firearm, or, they're so controlled in the West Bank. And they would love, versus Hamas can be toting machine guns in the streets, and they can be bad mouthing Israel all they want, and they can be shooting rockets. West Bank Palestinians, they're not allowed to do any of that. And so to them, Hamas are the freedom fighters. And if they had a vote today, Hamas would win by a landslide. So, it's even interesting that it's like who is in favor of Hamas and who supports them, and the nuance of even understanding the Palestinians as two totally divided populations right now, because they've been subjected to very different conditions and occupation and settlements and all that going into all of the politics. But yeah, going back to the actors, I do think that the actors right now are reflective, in Israel at least, are reflective of the people. And Bibi keeps getting elected, and the population has swung farther and farther right, and fewer Israelis are supportive of a peace solution, of a two-state solution where Palestinians have an independent state. Bibi is speaking to that and using it, and they know he was supporting Hamas. Mm-hmm. Like, it's all over the news. Like, the Knesset members have been talking about it forever, and they still support him because they see the threats as so great and their need for security, back to the security and for Palestinians justice, so great that someone like that, maybe, Americans support Trump for many of the same reasons, that like we need to shore up America, we need to shore up Israel and protect it and to have our security, and someone like Bibi is going to do it.
Mm-hmm. I want to say for the record that coming up with conspiracy theories is way more fun and makes me it makes me a much more entertaining dinner guest. I think where I come from, my perspective is, I'm trying to piece this stuff together, and it's not my primary focus, of course, but I clearly see how much it's affecting the rest of the world, to all your points you've mentioned earlier. And there do seem to be things that are not adding up. And then that's where my mind goes. It seems like there are other things going on. So I think asking those questions, especially when you consider we're only talking about, biblical level conflict. So what we think we know about the conflict it's not working. I think we can agree on that. And that's why I think my mind goes to some of these other possibilities, that maybe there are some other things that we're not privy to, or that we're not fully appreciating, to help bring some more nuance, some more clarity to it. But that's, like I said, that it makes me for a good dinner.
I can appreciate, of course, you got to have someone to throw the wild cards into the mix.
That's me. Yeah. Well, what about, we haven't even talked about lizard people yet. Right. We don't have enough time for that, but. Yeah.
The thing I don't like about conspiracy theories, and what I, especially when I was first, so like immersed in the Middle East, is that it was a way of people absolving themselves of responsibility.
Sure.
Oh, America is doing all this, not that we have any hand in the violence, or like the insurgency, or name the problem. Oh, they throw up their hands and like see it as these greater forces, greater than them, are controlling the situation. And so even if they were to try, there was no way that they would have an impact. Like, that goes counter to everything I've started with Euphrates, which is the impact of people at the grassroots. I learned from experience, change does not come from Washington. It only comes to Washington. Like, that there is no grand puppet master, Wizard of Oz, controlling things. It is actually up to, in this day and age, when we look out and see the problems that we are facing today and that our kids are facing, we have to each step up, or it's like shit's gonna hit the fan. Like, it is up to you and me, and we are the only ones that we can be, holding accountable for it. And if we don't, then that is the calamity. That is, when all hell breaks loose. Like, so it's almost like an affront to my personal sensibility of the kind of energy and engagement that is needed at this point in time.
It's a certainly valid point. And I think to your point, it can be very disempowering if your belief is, oh, it's the other. And to your point, it disavows them of any responsibility to whatever. And I totally get that. I do think, though, that not to belabor this too much, but I think it is possible that it's not just coming up with conspiracies for conspiracy's sake. It's about looking at the possibility that perhaps there are gaslighters, and not necessarily that there's some grand orchestration, but just, if nothing else, people with ulterior motives. It doesn't take too much to just draw some conclusions and say, because things are not adding up, and you're going, well, is it possible that there's another agenda that may overlap, with some of the current known agendas, but that skews it a little bit, that makes it a little bit more difficult to solve this problem. That's where my mind is just going, just intuitively, is that what we think we know clearly isn't enough because we're not solving this problem. So not to say that that alone is enough evidence. I've seen plenty of other things that in my mind there's a disconnect, or at least at the very least require follow-up questions. Anyway, that's just my
And is it enough for you to just to lay bare that those ulterior motives and those actors? Is the point to then be aware of those actors, but then ideally still continue to do the work? Or is it just 100%. Helpful?
No,
okay,
yeah, 100% is the outcome to me is peace, and that we need to take action and that we need to take responsibility. Each of us has a role, I think, to play, this podcast included. This is my small, tiny effort. Let me throw this out there into the universe to see if that jogs any ideas or loosens anything up or what have you. But 100%, it doesn't absolve us of anything. If anything, but that's kind of my point. If anything, maybe this does get us one step closer to the truth. Is it possible that there are those that are seeking to deceive? There's so much propaganda on this issue. There's so much propaganda right now on all issues. It does make it more difficult to figure out what's actually going on. And that alone, to me, does open up the door to, all right, well, we can't believe everything that we see. Let's dig a little bit deeper, which to me, in my opinion, is why your perspective is so valuable, because you've been on the ground. And
honestly, Peter, it's exactly to that point of, I went in with so much faith in government and like the power of America to transform, to make the world a better place, basically. And then to see, in effect, it was the inability, like our helplessness to even, whether it was contain an insurgency or put these vital building blocks for a democracy, which, okay, maybe that was a long-term gain and maybe I'm being premature, but I felt going in and seeing that the emperor had no clothes and was like, oh crap, like this is not how I'm going to actually make an effective difference in the world. And then to really boil it down further to, how does change happen? Does it happen from leaders? Does it happen from institutions? Does it happen, through systems change? Like, what is the actual unit, of building block of change? And I kept boiling it down to, no, okay, it's not the country to country. It's not, community or it's the personal level. Like it's the personal change, and how do we do that? And then as we change individually, we bring that into our relationships, and then we bring that into our teams, and then that transforms communities, and then that transforms the globe and systems on the globe. And that's really how we've structured the Euphrates whole programming, is that the unit of change is the individual, rather than these, forces or governments or institutions or all of that, because I did not see those as effective. And the most thing I want is to be effective, to actually make real lasting change. And so even on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, like, what am I spending my time on? It's on the individual level. It's bringing individual Palestinians and Israelis together to humanize, to really hear their stories, to really understand the humanity of the other, and then, them connecting with, like, to build on it from that foundation. Because you could sign a piece of paper tomorrow to have a peace treaty between the two sides, but if they hate each other, like, this problem is not going to be solved by a piece of paper. It's a relational, like, it's a human problem. And how do we solve human problems is by getting in touch more deeply with our own humanity and with the humanity of the other.
I know we're running a little bit short on time, unfortunately. I'd love to keep talking to you for another few hours, to be honest. But can you share one or maybe two examples of some of the progress that your institution has helped create impact for?
Gosh, well, just on this issue alone, we just hosted, it was a couple of weeks after October 7th, and we hosted a conversation between an Israeli and a Palestinian peace builder. They didn't know each other, but I knew them. And the Palestinian was like, look, I know people who have gotten death threats from appearing with Israelis on the news or, in conversation. And he's like, for decades, I've been doing this bridge building work with Israelis. And for the first time, it's like a physical threat, to my safety. And he said, but because of you, I'll do it. And I was worried, how they were going to come into the conversation, and are they going to be distrustful? So we get on this call, and it's such a tense time, and emotions are high, and they don't know each other. And it was so amazing to hear the reverence with which they spoke to each other. And the Israeli, for example, was saying, Elias was the Palestinian's name, just that you would have enough trust in me to come on this call today to have this conversation. And over 100 people were on the call, listening. And how can I support you? How can I engage with you in your work? Like that they were attempting to make peace in the midst of the worst violence that has happened in so many decades, in this
I think it's the
conflict.
most killed since the Holocaust.
Yeah,
exactly.
And the reverence and the trust, and the Palestinians didn't engage in well, you've done this and that. He was just and my brother Eyal is willing to engage in this dialogue, and what we most need is the humanization. I mean, people were moved to tears in just the sight of this kind of reverence and trust building and peace building in the midst of this horrible violence was incredible. And that's just and then the ripple since then, to work together with them. And we've had another conversation since then building on that one. And so just a small example. Another example that I can think of is one of our peace builders in Cote d'Ivoire. There was tribal conflict between these two tribes, the Garis and the Dozos. And, different entities had come in to try to resolve this conflict, and it was tearing the local fabric apart and the economy apart. And he, as a grassroots peace builder, was like, well, everyone was afraid to go in. And he's like, I'm going to go in and address this conflict. And he, by himself, went where no one else would go and went and started holding these workshops between these two tribes.
Amazing.
And he videoed, he taped one of them. They would they'd wear masks. So to role play, they were singing songs.
Wow.
He had a mix in the room, which they were just totally not wanting to engage even physically in the room. And so he is credited with being the person who reconciled these two tribes in this conflict. And now he's part of the staff of the Euphrates team. And this is, employing the methods that our program teaches. He went in and actually resolved a conflict. So it's just, it's small and grassroots. But to me, what's powerful is when you have a peace builder in one part of the world, thinking oh, I'm all alone. I'm just doing this little nothing thing. And then connecting with someone in India, connecting someone, South America. And then they're sharing they're peer learning. So they're sharing success stories, what worked, what didn't work. They're strengthening each other. And then you have that cross-pollination of peace building and the things that actually work. And then you see the support is strengthened. For example, I feel like this all the time. I'm not an Israeli or Palestinian. It's not my place to go fix their conflict. I'm not from there. I'm not Muslim or Jewish. I don't have family ties. I haven't lived on the land. You know what I mean? That is their role. But I can support them, and I can take inspiration from what they're doing. I can, cheer them on. And what they're doing then goes and further strengthens my desire and realization that I need to focus then on what I can work on, which is my own country, my own community. They can't fix this over here either. I'm the only one placed in my spot, in my unique sphere of influence that I can touch. And so something about that mutual encouragement and inspiration, knowing of what, especially in Gaza and Palestine right now, in Israel, knowing the conditions under which they are working, and that Kareem, our exchange student, now it's been 90 something days, he's holed up in an apartment. They've had to move 3 times. His apartment's been bombed.
Wow.
His, all of his extended family members are in one place. He has to walk miles for water. Probably not, but that's what he said, but a long way. And yet he still cares about peace. He still asks me every time, how are you, Janessa? How is the family? He has asked for nothing. Him walking his walk in the world, I am like, okay, if he can do that and have that attitude and still care about peace in Gaza, what am I doing in
Mhm.
Redding, California? You know, what
Mhm.
is mine to do? And something about that reciprocity and that exchange and that support, I believe, has a ripple effect that is much larger and more powerful than just individuals working on their own, you know, thinking we're just out there trying to do what we can. It's a support network and a community that builds on itself.
It reminds me of something that came to me not too long ago, which is the fact that in the game of chess, the pawn can take out the king. And sometimes it
Ah,
feels like we have this insurmountable force that we're up against. And yet when each person does their unique tiny thing that they can do, these things do add up.
yeah.
Janessa, your organization, your heart, I'm so grateful that you chose peace when you were sitting by the bank of the Euphrates. And the impact that you're making is a beacon of light, I think, for so many. For those that are interested in finding out more about what you do, where can they go?
Oh, they can go to euphrates.org, very simple, like the river. And just to that point, Peter, you know, my one little epiphany and starting this thing, I had no idea what I was doing. I just felt like I just need to, you know, have a voice for peace. I need to do one little thing. And it's now rippled out to over 40 countries around the world
Amazing.
and growing. So it's so true that, you know, when we each do our part and connect to those other like-minded souls, then, you know, you never know where the river will flow.
Beautifully stated. Janessa, thank you so much for your time. I know you got family to get off to, so we so appreciate it. Maybe we can have you on and keep the conversation going at some point.
Would love to, Peter. Thank you so much. Thanks for all the questions and your role that you're playing with this and impacting those, you know, interested in all these issues and who knows what ripple effects you're putting into motion.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It means a lot to me. Thanks again.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Wired for Impact. If you're interested in creating and expanding your impact, be sure to visit us online at impactnow.com.